Hello, today we're going to discuss the war on drugs. This issue is discussed in the podcast Andrea Wolf's class listened to for session Friday, April 17th, 2020. While I was listening to the podcast, I was surprised by a few things. The biggest surprise to me was that President Bush actually bought a baggie of crack out in front of the White House to be used in one of the speeches he was about to do. If I would not have heard this in the podcast, I would have never had any knowledge about this. I realized I was so undereducated on how they had dealt with this in the past. Before listening to the podcast, I assumed there was simply a drug problem and the government was working to resolve the issue. I didn't realize to what extent they were actually trying to fix this problem. There were a lot more details backing this than simply arresting people and trying to bring awareness to the fact that this was an issue. It was unknown to me the efforts and different ways they attempted to resolve this. Aside from the shock and lack of knowledge, I was able to learn about the transformation of how the drug crisis was handled in the United States throughout this time. Some of the things I learned from listening to the podcast was why selling drugs had become popular, the amount of drugs it took to be considered for a large prosecution, and the variety of ways they attempted to resolve this issue. Selling drugs was a popular way of gaining money during this time because there weren't enough jobs for people. There wasn't enough money coming into a household to support the amount of people living there. One of the people from the podcast said he was offered $500 a week to stand on a corner and sell drugs. This was nearly as much as his mother was bringing in for an entire month. She was only bringing in $700 for the family of four. With things like this happening, I could understand why so many people turned to selling drugs. I was amazed the amount of drugs it took to get a long period of jail time was so small. At this time, 5 grams was enough to land a person 10 plus years in prison. 5 grams of crack is only about a teaspoon of the drug. This is less sugar than I put in my mug of coffee. In the beginning of trying to solve the issue, the punishments were out of proportion for the amount of drugs being sold. They also didn't give any warnings or anything to first-time offenders. For example, the young man, Keith Jackson, the President Bush bought crack from outside of the White House, had previously sold 3 undercover officers drugs and then to the president. He was sentenced to 10 years in 1989. These convictions seemed absolutely overboard. After all of this had happened, there was a 3-strike law that was passed through in 1994. This gives offenders a chance to show their behavior isn't repeat, lessening the amount of overall jail time unless they are convicted again. After the 3rd strike, there was likely to be larger punishments. Although there had been progress made in reducing the drug crisis, there was always more work that could be made.